Good evening. Welcome to ASDPH headquarters. We're very pleased to be able to safely convene in person again. A warm welcome as well to those of you tuning online. I'm Laura Magaña, President and CEO of ASDPH, the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. This evening, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Sandro Galea, a physician, epidemiologist, author, Dean and Robert Knox Professor at Boston University School of Public Health. He has published extensively in the peer-reviewed literature as he's a regular contributor to a range of public media about the social causes of health, mental health, and the consequence of trauma. He has been listed as one of the most widely cited scholars in the social science. He is also past chair of ASDPH Board of Directors. Joining Dr. Galea is Lisa Palmer, a science journalist, author, and the National Geographic Professor of Science Communication at George Washington University. Welcome, you both. I, like all of you, I'm eager to hear the conversations around Dean Galea's recently published and generously reviewed book, The Contagion Next Time, which explores the foundation of health and society, how we got to COVID-19 pandemic, and what we can do to prevent the inequities from emerging when the next pandemic strikes. Without further ado, Sandra and Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to speak with you. And have enjoyed reading the book so far. I'm most of the way through. We're fortunate we were able to have the advanced copies. Those of you will be getting the new rollout as it's just been published. But before I even picked it up, and as I started reading it, you start to talk about sort of why, how you got to writing the book. But I'd like to just begin. I want to ask you about that shared experience that we all in this room feel of when we first, all of us had it, when we first sort of grasped just how big the pandemic was going to be. And sort of take me to that moment when it was with SARS-CoV-2 that you really saw this something the world will change.
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, thank you for doing this. I don't think I had any prescience more than anybody else. I think at the beginning of March, I remember towards the end of February, I was giving a talk where I wove in an understanding of COVID into my talk, which wasn't really part of my script, and I started thinking about it. And then the beginning of March hit, and I realized that this is coming and this was going to be a real concern. And I realized right there that what was going to happen was we were going to have this enormous social patterning of what was going to happen, that the consequences are going to be borne by those who typically bear the consequences of really all bad things in our society. And that we should be speaking out for that. And I wrote a number of pieces, a number of my colleagues wrote a number of pieces saying, if this is going to come as a wave, it's going to become a pandemic, we need to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable. And that really was the genesis of this book. It was an awareness that the consequences of COVID are not going to be experienced evenly, and that we as a society had a responsibility to try to mitigate that as much as we could. Of course, we failed. We failed because COVID was experienced deeply unevenly, and it was experienced very irregularly across society, and those who are most vulnerable the harshest consequences of COVID. And I think eventually it became this book that comes from a place of saying, really, we should not make this mistake again. So the book is about the next contagion. It's sort of in some respects says, this is what it is. We've lived through it. We're muddling through it. It will end sooner or later. But now is the time to start reimagining how we live in the world around us so that the next time the contagion hits, we do better. And there's so much better that we can do.
So, in that same context, just as a follow-up, you talked, there was a moment where you said, I know enough about sort of these disparities, these contexts that people will be experiencing this in uneven ways. So I guess, why did you want to write a book about that?
Yeah, I want to write a book. So the timing of these, the way these books work is for a book to be published November 1st, 2021, you have to finish the book by a year ago, roughly. So this book was written the second half of 2020. And my thinking was that by this time, the fall of 2021, there will be a number of books being published that are about what we should be doing to prevent future pandemics. And that those books will predominantly be about vaccines, about surveillance systems, about technology that we need to develop to protect us. Now, I'm nothing against that. I actually think the vaccine development in the time of COVID has been extraordinary. We can talk about that. And I think those books are important. But I think while they may be necessary, they're not sufficient. None of that will actually help. None of that will help us from being the country with the most number of cases or number of deaths per population that we were during COVID. None of that will help us not to have wider racial and socioeconomic gaps in terms of who experiences COVID. In order to avoid that, we need to pay attention to the forces that contribute to that. And vaccines, which are in many respects a treatment approach, are just something to get us out of it, but they do not help us deal with the fundamental character of COVID that we experience. So I really wanted a book out there to put these thoughts in the public conversation. If we're going to start thinking about what should we be doing differently, I don't want us to lose sight of these foundational things that we need to be doing.
For example, like you give some really good stories in the book. That's what I found to be so engaging. So,
yeah,
for example.
I mean, let's talk about just one example. We know that Black Americans died at twice the rate of white Americans during COVID. So the question is, why is that? And most people know that at this point, but the question is, why is that? Well, there are two reasons for that. Number one is that the risk of getting COVID depends on your occupation and whether or not your job allows you to distance yourself from other people. And we know this is well established that higher wage jobs, you're more likely to be able to work from home and be distanced from other people. Lower wage jobs, you're not. Disproportionately, people who are socioeconomically marginalized, and that has a lot of overlap with people of color in this country, are less able to work remotely. As a result, more exposed to COVID, higher risk of getting COVID. That's number one. Number two, COVID severity is directly linked to having underlying disease, underlying morbidity, hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease. Well, our underlying prevalence is distributed by race because, again, to just focus on Black-white differences for a second, Black Americans have decades and centuries of marginalization and disadvantage, and they bear the brunt of preventable disease much more than do other groups. So as a result, higher prevalence, higher risk of underlying disease, resulting in greater mortality. So these are not mysteries. They really reflect how we structure our society, our underlying social divisions, our underlying economic divisions. And no amount of vaccine development, no amount of technological development is going to change that, which really is the thesis of the book, that yes, technological development is important, but unless we tend to these foundational forces, we are going to have the same thing happen with the next pandemic. And of course, the implicit premise is another pandemic will happen. It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when.
So, it's something as an author myself and having experience, going through writing a book or writing on a subject, and you kind of pull different threads together to make it stick. I'm curious as how you felt that these threads, that as you begin to pull the threads of stories together for your book, like what did you reach for? What were some of the decisions that you had to make along the way in putting this together, the story?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of describing it. I think there's a temptation in a book like this to be really negative. There's a temptation. I mean, in some respects, I feel like whenever I'm invited to speak, somebody invites the public health person and you're wheeled out to say bad things and to say the sky is.
You're in the bad silo.
You're like, people are putting together, panels or speakers are like, we need somebody to check off the sky is falling box and let's bring out the public health person. So I think that's very tempting. And I really wanted to make sure that this book did not do that. So the book starts, as you know, with the world is a healthier, better place than it's ever been. And I don't want to lose sight of that. I mean, 200 years ago, life expectancy in this country was 40. Now close to 80. I mean, that's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary achievement. So I start with that. And then I move on to saying, now here is how we can do even better. And then I try to end on hope. I try to end on what is it that we should be doing and talk about the compassion that we need in order to make the changes that we need to make to do even better. So I really try to ground the book by leaning into hope and leaning into optimism, because I think it's too easy to get nihilistic and to say, these are difficult problems about which we can do nothing. And I actually think we can do things, and I actually think we are headed in the right direction. Sometimes it feels painful to get there, but I think we can.
I think, but from my and just sort of reading some of the scenarios in the book, you weave hope in throughout. It's not just waiting at the end, but one I guess instance that really struck me when you were writing about an experience of a man. Imagine a man. I don't know if this is somebody that you know or had experienced who was born in the early part of the 20th century. He had left school at a young age to start to take part in the war effort. He came back and then experienced the Depression alongside a coexisting PTSD and difficulties with work, and then ended up sort of succumbing to alcoholism and died. And so you talk about sort of like how that he wasn't really set up for health. And actually that story really struck home with me, because that actually what happened to my dad. He died a couple of days before my first day at BU, starting Boston University, from very similar circumstances. The youngest of 9 children, 7 of them had survived to adulthood, born in the Depression, dealing with a lot of the same issues there, dying from alcoholism in his 40s. But then, you talk about people who are now born in the 1990s, just after that. My son was born then, and having also dealt with health issues there, what are the kinds of social, educational opportunities and things that really has helped him succeed in life when he's may have otherwise in another situation not have fallen through the cracks. So you bring up these stories, and I'm wondering how are you finding the these people responding to these threads and these stories? Are the people kind of seeing themselves in this book, as a lived experience? Because I certainly could see it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose what I try to do in this book is to tell stories that explain public health concepts that are sometimes abstract. And that story that you narrated from the book tries to explain that health is generated over our life, that health comes over the life course. We tend to think of health as a static picture. You look at me today and you say, he's healthy. On a scale of 1 to 10, your rating 7.7, fine. But however healthy or not healthy I am today is a product of my 50 years of life. Like it experiences I've had all the way from childhood, young adult, adolescence, young adulthood, middle-aged adulthood is what creates me today. And same for you and same for everybody else in the audience. And we forget that. Now, why is it important? It's important because it says, well, to create health today, it's not good enough to simply look at me today. If we actually really want me to be healthy, we need to go back and make sure we improve the conditions that brought me to today. And that approach leads you to think of health in a very different way than to think of, well, if you're not well today, let's just give you a pill. If you're not well today, you can have the blue pill, the red pill. Because when you realize that health is generated over our lifetime, you say, well, what can we do to make sure that the conditions in your childhood, in your adolescence, in your young adulthood are conditions that make you healthy by the time you get to 40, 50, 60, and 70. And that means that inevitably makes you think of health as the product of the conditions of the world around us, not simply as something that is generated by medicine that deals with your sickness problem today. And those are 2 very different ways of looking at the state of our health.
And that maybe can get to the children, of our lifetime. The children experiencing the pandemic now, children are becoming more. More of them can get vaccinated, but also they've missed school. And how does this sort of wrap into the whole discussion of health and wellness?
I'm often asked, like, what's the one thing that we should do that's going to have the most impact? I mean, one thing that we should do is going to have most impact is always to invest in our children, because they have a longer trajectory in which we can actually inflect their trajectory to be better. And I think it's one of the sadnesses of the pandemic has been, for example, how we've dealt very clumsily with things like school closures. if there's one thing we know that's associated with better health, is it's better academic achievement, it's better school achievement. In fact, it's a very classic dose-response relationship. The more people are in school, the longer people are in school, the healthier they are. We know that. So we went about closing schools, restricting children's economic, social, emotional development, which restricts then their economic function and well-being over the life course. This generation has been set behind. This generation has been set behind, and that is going to have implications for their health throughout their lifetime. And I don't think that we were sophisticated enough to weigh the downstream over the life course harms that we were doing in our approach to school closures, because we were so worried about the short-term potential implications of COVID. And I think a better approach would be one where we understand this and we balance the pros and cons. I'm not saying there were easy answers. But I think the approach we took was grounded in a limited understanding of what really generates health, that health comes over our lifetime.
So, and kind of looking at some of the ways that the story kind of throughout the book advances, and maybe you can talk to me about sort of how these came about, but you, the images, the visuals, the infographics in there really can help advance the story. One of them particularly struck me was there were two pictures of stick figures with that was filled with different colors related to how much it was related. It was a medicine, and then all these different other elements that added up to their health and wellness. So can you talk to me a little bit about sort of why these visuals are so important in advancing the story?
Yeah, so the book has a number of these sort of graphics, which we were very lucky that we had an intern, Cappy Arnold, who worked with us on creating them. And the one that Lisa is referring to is a figure of a person colored in to show what produces health. And health, generally speaking, it's understood that medicine produces 10 to 20% of our health. The other 80% are conditions of where we live, where we work, where we play. It's whether we exercise, whether we smoke, whether we drink, whether we have unsafe sex. It is our education, it is our job. That's the other 80%. That's one figure. But then on the other side, I show what we spend our money on health. And in fact, we spend 90% of our money on the 20%. So 90% of our money is spent strictly on medicines and doctors. And I use that to show this mismatch, that we as a country spend far more on health than any other high-income country, by about 40%, by an extraordinary amount more. But we as a country have lived shorter, sicker lives than all other high-income countries. Now, I often challenge audiences to say, name one other sector where we spend more but get worse outcomes than all other countries. And the truth is, there is no other sector. Sometimes people say defense, but the outcomes in defense are very dodgy. But the truth is, there is no other sector where we find it acceptable to spend more and get less. I often use the example, imagine if your smartphone, if I were to tell you it's going to cost more than buying it in any other high-income country, but by the way, it's going to hold less data and be slower. How would you feel about that? You'd say, well, that's not a good deal. Right? It's not a good deal. Why am I going to pay more? 40% more, not just a little bit more. But that's what we do with our health. We actually think that that's acceptable with our health. And I actually find that baffling. I find it baffling that we find that acceptable. And I think the reason for that is that we keep misunderstanding health. We keep misunderstanding it. And the pandemic, in some respects, stands to deepen that misunderstanding. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we only think that the way out of pandemics is just vaccines, if that's what we think, that's going to deepen that misunderstanding, because then it's going to say the way out of pandemic is let's just invest as much money as we possibly can only on vaccines. And the point I'm making is that's good. We want great vaccines. Vaccines were an enormous triumph. It's a really triumph of a new technology. It's wonderful. But if we just do that, we are still going to have the failure that COVID was. And I want to make sure that we think about that right up front.
I think if I remember correctly, like the health was up to your ankle, and then the rest of it was,
It's exactly right.
So, I think, in that realm, the decisions, but where does our decision-making come from?
Yeah.
In that?
Yes. So I suppose it depends on how one sees the role of decision makers. So if one thinks of decision makers as sort of omniscient beings who think about things and tell the rest of us what to do. That's one way of thinking. I don't think that's how it works. I actually think that people in positions of authority, whatever level it is, are fundamentally reflecting the conversation. They're reflecting our shared understanding, and then they are helping to implement the shared understanding. So I think where to start has to be with our shared understanding. You know, we've done surveys that ask people, what do you think matters most for your health? Well, most people say, it's my doctor. That needs to change. We need most people to say, I think what matters most for my health is the fact that I'm actually in a safe, warm house. Or what matters most in my health is that I actually have a reasonable education that has afforded me a good quality of life. Or what matters most for my health is that I live in a neighborhood where I'm not afraid of dying from violence. That's what matters most for my health. Because I think once we the people, say that, it will shift the political conversation to say, if we're making decisions about transportation, we're making decisions about housing, we're making decisions about finances, what are the health implications? What are the health implications of all these policies? So because ultimately, we all care about health. Like health is a unifying value. I care about health, you care about health. I've yet to meet anybody who said, I don't really want my kids to be healthier. Like everybody wants their kids to be healthy, right? But how many other values can you think of where everybody wants the same value? Like we all want our kids to be healthy. So that means it could be a unifying value as long as we understand what creates it. And right now, I think we have the value. We all want our kids to be healthy. Therefore, let's spend all our money on medicines. What I want us to do is to say, we all want our kids to be healthy. Let's make sure we create a world that makes them healthy. Yes, making sure we have medicines for when we're sick. Similarly, with pandemic, we don't really want to go through a pandemic which threatens our children. Let's make sure that we have a world that protects us from that, even as we have vaccines to get us out of it if a pandemic hits.
So with regard to having to look at what our children will be facing, we expect that there will be other big events, big shocks, big whether it's climate driven, whether it's other types of weather catastrophes or extreme events or political events. What are those health disparities? How will they play out with those types of shocks? Or you equate them in a similar way.
Yeah, unfortunately, these health gaps are mirrored in all shocks. I mean, you take hurricanes. Hurricanes hit, and you end up with people who have low wages, less wealth, people of color who are the ones who bear the brunt of this. Where I think the pandemic is useful, if I may use that term, is that it showed us that it is inadequate to say, this is not my problem if people over there are suffering. Because much of the time, I think we give ourselves a pass by saying, well, if you're saying that, I can buy my way out of this problem. So therefore, it's not really my problem. I may be charitable and I may care, but it's not really my problem. Well, what the pandemic teaches us is that actually we all have come to realize that if you have the virus, it's a threat to me. So it's no longer good enough to say, I don't need to worry about you. You're your problem, not my own problem. That we're all connected. So once you understand that, it actually, I think, elevates the problem and says we need whole society solutions. It's no longer good enough to say, I can wall myself off. And we've learned that from this pandemic, which I think pushes us to a point I try to make in the book, which is that you need compassion. Compassion means you don't need to be able to see the world through other people's eyes. You need to simply say, we have a shared humanity. And because of our shared humanity, we need to make sure that we all are healthy together. And I think that's what the pandemic should teach us. And if it doesn't teach us that, we're not paying attention.
So, as a journalist who's focused on the solutions orientation of things, I like to look at the problem, but I also like to look at the solutions. And this does that to some degree. Where could we go deeper and looking and examining and critically examining some of the solutions that you present?
Yeah, the question is sort of which set of solutions is one going to take on? And my answer to that is sometimes I realize an unsatisfying pragmatic answer. I think we need a radical vision, and I try to propose a radical vision. Others have proposed radical visions. But the answers, the implementation answers, are pragmatic and incremental. And you see it happening right now. You see it happening right now in the national political system. These enormous debates about, for example, things like infrastructure. There's a lot of things that are currently being debated that are really positive. They could be really positive towards some of these goals. to get there is going to require the incremental implementation, the intersection of radical vision with pragmatism about what is possible within the complex structures that we live within. So do I think that investing in early childhood education is a good thing? Yes. Do I think that actually having livable wages guaranteed for everybody is a good thing? Yes. Do I think that having opportunity for everybody to have affordable housing is a good thing? Yes. Do I think we can get all of those at the same time? No. I think it's important that we push on all these fronts so that they can happen when they happen for as many people as possible, because ultimately that's how you build a healthier society.
So is the pandemic a leverage point?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think if it's not a leverage point, I don't know what will be. Like I should think if this moment is not a moment that makes us say, we should be better than this. Like we actually should have a better social structure that protects us. Like what will it take to get us there? I mean, this has been a devastating pandemic. 700,000 people. COVID became the third leading cause of death in 2020 after heart disease and cancer. Forget COVID. I'm going to tell you today that in 2024, a disease you've never heard about, a name you've never heard, is going to become the third leading cause of death in 2024. If I told you that, just think about how that feels when I tell you that. I suspect you're all thinking like, well, that doesn't sound so good. And the next thought is, what can we do to prevent that? Well, that's how we should be thinking about the consequences of COVID. Like COVID became the third leading cause of death. We had never heard of it until December 31st, 2019. It became the third leading cause of death in 2020. And if we do not learn from what went wrong in COVID, really, we're never going to learn. So this should be a teachable moment for all of us.
So, taking a look at these hard, health disparities, these hard questions of race, these hard questions of economic inequality, of housing. Sometimes I when I'm talking to people about this as well, and I want to hear from you, people push back on that. They think, oh, it's choice, or it's this, or it's that. What are you hearing from people, and how do you respond to these hard questions? Yeah,
I think I'm glad you're raising the question of choice, because it always comes up. There is no question. Let's be clear that there is individual autonomy in everything we do, and we should never forget that ultimately every individual should have autonomy, and every individual should have latitude to make choices. And as a result, some individuals will make better choices than others, and we should accept that. What we do not understand is that our choices are constrained, that ultimately we have choice sets that are constrained by the circumstances of the world around us. And that is often invisible to us. So let's take one concrete example, which is exercise. And you'll hear this often to say, well, I choose to exercise. Well, you choose to exercise, yes, within a context that allows you to exercise, because actually you have the resources to be able to exercise. You live in a neighborhood that is safe for you to walk in, versus you live in a neighborhood where you're afraid of getting shot if you go out on the front door. That's one way of looking at it. Let's take food. Obesity has roughly tripled in this country in the past 30 years. That's not because our behaviors have changed that much. I mean, humans are humans. We haven't changed that much what we eat. What has really changed is the calorie content of food. We have much more widespread availability of nutrient-poor, calorie-rich, really affordable food. And that means that the same choice of behavior 30 years ago and the same choice of behavior today results now in much more risk of obesity than it used to be 30 years ago, right? So these are all, yes, choices, but the consequences of those choices are shaped by the world around us. So I think it's on us to create a world where our choices are as safe as possible. Of course, the most concrete example of this is motor vehicle accidents. So we have reduced the risk of dying from being in a car over the past 100 years by 200-fold. Now, are drivers 200 times safer than they were 200 years ago? No, like nobody would argue that. No, we've done this, right? By seat belts, airbags, and shatterproof glass and laws to make sure that people are not driving under the influence. That's what we've done. Now, have we constrained choice? Well, I suppose we've constrained your choice not to get into a car without a seatbelt, but it is a trade-off we're well willing to make for a 200-fold decrease in risk of dying from motor vehicle crashes. And we keep thinking of that there's a myth, right? There's a myth that we want to have unfettered choice over everything, but none of us have unfettered choice over everything. We live within the rules and norms that we establish for ourselves. And this is simply an argument for establishing the rules and norms that allow us individual autonomy, but also maximize our chances of being healthy.
We'll be getting to some questions from the audience in a minute, but hopefully you'll be thinking of some for us. But I wanted to just, I thought that the cover of the book was really fascinating. When I first picked it up, saw it, an image of a child. You touch on a little bit about why our children. Sort of talk to me about sort of the way that this captures the vision of what you see as sort of this hopeful future. It's both idealistic, pragmatic, but there's a lot of idealism in here. So, what do you ideally want our kids to, have access to, or have the ability to weather these big shocks that they'll undoubtedly see in their lifetimes?
Yeah, I mean, I love the cover. I mean, it was the publishers doing, and I think anytime you write anything about the next time, you're fundamentally writing about people who are younger than you, because they have more next times than you do. And I want, when my kids are adults and there is another pandemic, which there will be, I want the consequences to be much more manageable than they were for this pandemic. So I actually thought having a child on the cover was an appropriate metaphor for that fundamentally our investment in creating a better world is to create a better world for those who are younger than us. And that's okay. Like, that's how it should be. That's how it should be. We should be making investments so the next generation is healthier, and they should be making investments so the next generation is healthier. And I suppose part of it comes back to where we started, which is with hope and the notion that I do think the world is better now than it was 100 years ago, than it was 200 years ago. And I really hope that the world will be better 100 years from now. That's what we should aspire to.
These next generation, you thinking it's going to be taking 10 years, 20 years to make these changes, or, will we see some changes sooner?
I think change happens discontinuously. Like we tend to think of change as linear, like things change on a regular basis, but it does, but there are discontinuities. And if you take a look at the current reckoning with racial justice, the events of 2020 triggered by police killing of unarmed Black men and women, particularly George Floyd, but also triggered by a strong sense of the injustice about the unevenly experienced pandemic. I think that has brought to a fore these issues of racial inequities that aren't new. I mean, they had been there for centuries in a way that really they had not been. They had not been to a fore like that for generations. And that's a good thing. Like that is important. And it was, of course, impossible to predict that. So I do think that things get better slowly, and then there's discontinuous change, and change happens. Things get better slowly. There's discontinuity that's unpredictable. And that of course, is a hallmark of a complex system, because the world is a complex system. It is a lot of autonomous beings, us humans, interacting with one another in complex ways. So I don't know, but I hope that there are things that will be changing in the short term, and that we will be leaning into the things that we do well, so we can do more of them.
We have some people here. I hope you have questions, and please let us know that there's mics here too.
So thank you both for the conversation. Thank you for the book. I have a question about your role as the dean of the School of Public Health, and particularly about the students. And I'm curious as to what changes you've seen over the last 2 years, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, sorts of students who are becoming attracted to public health, how it's changed, the experience of living through the pandemic, how it's affected the kinds of courses they want to take, the work they want to do, their optimism or lack of optimism.
Yeah, thank you. It's an extraordinary privilege to be a dean of any school, just because you're constantly surrounded by people who are earlier in their life course and who believe in the possible. And I never want them to lose that. And I think in the past couple of years, we see this wave of enormously committed future public health practitioners. And I think they're enormously committed, even more so than they ever have been, to the core issues that should animate public health, the issues of social, economic, and racial justice. And I think the pandemic has galvanized these students. I think that they come to us saying, I have seen what can happen if we're not paying attention to the core needs of public health, and I want to be part of a future that changes that. So it is perhaps the greatest insulation I have against being overly negative, because I look at the students who enter our program and they are fantastic, and they really lean into a radical vision. And our job is to teach them how to make that vision a reality. Our job is to teach them the pragmatics of how one changes policy, of how one goes about doing the hard work of building structures that stand the test of time, that move beyond the rhetoric and move beyond the idea, how to make sure that the vision is accompanied by execution. And that's our job. And my hope is that when they finish our program, they learn that. But our students in our school and all schools of public health really, to my mind, represent the best of idealism that is interested in learning pragmatically how to create a better world.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the book. Full disclosure, I'm really thankful. And thanks for this forum. So I want to pick up on the last thing that you said. Running through part of the book that I read is a tension between power on the one hand and truth on the other hand, insofar as today's scientific consensus is a proxy for the truth. So one takes an optimistic perspective, as you have. What is your sense of the evolution of that tension or the clash between power and the truth to enable us get where you would like us to be?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think it's impossible to answer that question without taking a cold, hard look at how we experience this pandemic. And we experience this pandemic through the lens of an enormously fractured, divided political time. We experienced this pandemic at a time when, for a variety of historical reasons, we can get into those, we had a president who felt the need to politicize elements of the pandemic that should never have been politicized. And that early on established a pattern where particular perspectives on the pandemic acquired a color. By color, I mean a red or blue. And that created this narrative where if you thought a certain way, you must be red, or if you thought a certain way, you must be blue. And that did not allow us to have the genuine exchange of ideas to get to truths that are complex. Because reductive simplifications, either red or blue, are never the truth. The truth is always purple. The truth is always in the middle. The truth always includes elements from multiplicity of voices, but we never had those multiplicity of voices because we had such divisions right from the beginning about the pandemic that it did not allow us to have conversations about complex truths. So we need to make sure we never do that again. We need to make sure that we never experience a pandemic in this way again, because difficult moments require the engagement of multiple voices. You know, the other element of this, of course, was that the public square at the moment is broadly being lived through social media. And social media is a very poor substitute for public square because it's an algorithmically driven form of discussion that elevates assertive, dispositive, emotional approaches over far cooler-headed, more reasoned approaches. And that, I think, has not helped us. And this was a pandemic experience at a time when we're still early, right, in understanding how to use social media to guide public debate. We're early. I mean, we'll figure this out. Like, we will figure this out. And but it's going to take us some time. And we certainly experienced it at a moment in time when we did not know how to do that. In much the same way, if you go back 20 years, when 9/11 happened, I mean, 9/11 was the first large-scale disaster in this country that was experienced in real time through 24/7 news media, through television. Right? It was a medium, and we experienced the narrative of 9/11 emerge through that medium. Similarly, the narrative of this pandemic emerged through social media, and that really challenged us in terms of getting at the truth.
I actually have a follow-up question
Yeah.
to that, kind of looking at sort of the power dynamics, as well as kind of going to John Sawyer's question around what the school, your school is doing. How are you looking at that to bridge those, just the different audiences for the work that you're doing, whether it's with the medical community, whether it's with governments, how are you bridging this information around power dynamics as well as what you're offering your students?
Yeah, I think the role of universities is to create a space for people committed to these ideals to develop their ideas and to communicate them. The role of universities is to say to students, to faculty, to staff, this is a place where ideas can emerge and where we can teach ideas to our students so that they can come up with their own ideas. So it is less what we are doing as a school and more what our faculty are doing to generate these ideas and what our students are doing to take up those ideas and move them forward. And I think one of the challenges for us as a school, and I mean this about our school, but I think any school of public health, is to get too swept up in a heterodoxy of ideas that comes too quickly. It's very easy, for example, for school public health, it's very easy to say, I don't understand how anybody could not want the vaccine. I think it's a very dangerous statement because if in a country we have 20 to 30% of people who are hesitant about getting vaccine, it is our job as a school of public health to try to understand how it is that a substantial proportion of people do not want to get vaccines. So I think our danger is seeing the world through a particular lens and only through that lens. And I think our job is to open up that lens so that we can have a wider lens so we can actually try to understand the entire population. Because fundamentally, this is the health of the public. And the public is all the public with its plurality of perspectives. And our job is to try to understand it.
Questions? Yes.
I have yet read the book, Forward to It, and I really like the concept of taking threads to tell a story. And so my question is, how does this build on your previous excellent book, Well, to tell the story?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rita. I think in Well, I laid this groundwork. And what I'm trying to do with this book is to say, now we have a case study. And Well, in some respects, was a more theoretical book. So it laid the groundwork. And here, I'm saying, we are now seeing how those concepts they articulated in Well, how they hit when a real crisis happens. It's sort of this is where the rubber hits the road. And here is what has happened because we have not been paying attention to those concepts. In some respects, as I was doing an interview and the interviewer correctly said, well, the first half of the book is almost not even about the pandemic. The first half of the book is continuing the narrative I started in Well, and then I bring the pandemic into it. So I'm trying to use the pandemic, and I'm being explicit about this, as a teachable moment that says, if we do not pay attention to these issues now, when will we? Like we never will. Now is the moment to pay attention. So that's how I see the thread between it.
I mean, is this a time for us to do like a values assessment, like what we value to get us there, or what is it?
I actually think it's. I agree. Actually, I like that very much, and it is the time to surface that we value health.
Something's up there.
Something's up.
They like that. They like that question.
Something I said or something you said.
Yeah, both.
We value health, and now is the time to remember that. But it's not enough to just say we value it. It is we need to take a hard look at how we act to generate health and say we need to do better.
The question back here, Cam, and then.
I wanted to go back to what you said about education, and that this was not something that our country prioritized. are there other countries that you think did better than we did? And what would you do next time in this country?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that by saying there were many other countries that were better positioned to face the pandemic than we were. And the reason they were better positioned is because they had, for a longer time, invested in the conditions that create health and in having a healthier population. Remember, we actually have the worst health of any of the high-income countries, just comparing high-income countries as a bucket. So I think in many ways, all the other high-income countries were better positioned than we were. I do think that in the immediate set of actions that we took as a country, it's impossible to look at them without looking at them through the particular political lens of the moment when these decisions were made. And one book which I'm really looking forward to reading, that some historian will write sooner or later, is a history of February 15th to March 15, 2020, just the history of that 1 month. Because I think decisions were made that have had implications for years thereafter. And it's impossible to actually look at those decisions without looking at the particular actors who were in particular positions at that moment in time. So I think other countries did better or worse in particular actions, but I'm less concerned with those particular actions because I think those depended on the particularities of the actors. I'm much more concerned with how prepared we were for it. And I think we were worse prepared compared to all other high-income countries. And that is borne out by the fact that we had worse outcome than all other high-income countries. And that was entirely predictable. Once a virus hit us that was going to particularly hit people with more underlying disease, which this virus did, right? Well, we have a greater burden of underlying disease than all other high-income countries. So by definition, we were going to do worse. And that's exactly what
could write the prologue on that book. I remember on February 13th, I had my annual checkup with my doctor, and he said, he said, go home and buy 3 weeks worth of food. This is going to happen,
Your doctor was prescient.
Yes, I did actually.
You did.
Listen. We had another question.
My question is kind of connected to yours. And it relates when you talked about audiences. So I'm thinking about our interprofessional and multi-sectoral partners that we don't even know how to work with us. What do you recommend that we can do to communicate to them what's needed now to prevent, mitigate, remediate?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Fundamentally, if you buy the argument that to generate health, you need the work of transportation, of housing, of finance, of sanitation, of environment, of parks and recreation. If you buy that argument, and to be honest, I actually think fundamentally that argument is inarguable. One can talk about it, we'll all get to consensus on that. Then you realize that no one sector can do it alone. Right? Public health, our role is principally a convener. It's principally as a catalyst of these other sectors to work together to achieve the conditions that generate health. So I think that it pushes us to make sure that our students learn that their role is that of a convener, as a catalyst, as a bringer together of people. And that is in many respects a very distinct skill set, say, than is a technical skill set that says you are going to do everything yourself. Because we can't do this ourselves. Nobody in public health can do this by themselves. This requires the collective action of many. Somebody recently used a metaphor, which I liked, which is, it's like in a cabinet, all the ministers are ministers of health. And I thought it was actually a useful metaphor. But of course, the Minister of Finance never sees herself as Minister of Health. The Minister of Housing and Urban Development doesn't see herself as a Minister of Health, but they should, right? They should. And it is our job to help effect that shift. I keep waiting for and this will happen. This will happen. I keep waiting for the presidential debate where the candidates on the red party or the blue party in the primaries, they debate whether a particular policy action, let's say on housing, will improve health or not. That's what I want to see. And when that happens, it's when we know that this message has penetrated.
So Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
This is one concern. So Eric has said, in regard to the focus on medicine and clinical intervention, do you think that the focus is facilitated by the fact that physicians typically are the directors and the FDA?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I will preface that by saying that I think the physician who's the director of CDC is doing an excellent job, and I think it's terrific at what she does. So I don't want to be, I want to make sure my comment is not interpreted as saying anything about individuals. I think it reflects a broad physician-centric approach that physicians have a particular window on health that other groups do not have. And I think that approach will shift over time. And physicians will always remain a critical part of health, because when we are sick, we all want a physician to look after us and restore us to health. But physicians are ultimately one part of the fabric of what generates health. And I see no reason why directors of CDC, directors of the FDA cannot be people who are trained in health from multiple angles, who do not necessarily have to be physicians or nurses or clinically trained. I think I go back to my point about around every kitchen table, you want the conversation to say, what matters most to you for health? And you say, it's the house I'm in. Actually, I'm in a warm, safe house, rather than it's my doctor or my nurse. Until we get to that point, we are going to keep looking for clinicians to be leading organizations that we see as important symbolically for health. We'll get to that point. This will shift.
So what other areas do you feel, I mean, I see that what you're kind of saying is you're softening the edges of these pieces that don't really fit together. They go up against each other, but we need to feel like they're more softened and working with each other.
Well, for example, I don't think you need physicians to lead schools of public health. And so I see myself as part of that sort of old guard that way. It is about recognizing that the generation of health depends on many sectors beyond the clinical sector. And that reflects a fundamental shift in our thinking about health.
We have time for one more question. Is that right? Yes, John.
I'm curious about your view of the news media role in covering the pandemic. My view is many examples of spectacular and wonderful reporting, extraordinary. But in general, I would say, looking back over the last 20 months or so, the news media, I think, has generated more heat than light. And if we think that we really help bring the country together the way we might, and I'm curious of your view of that, and what lessons, if any, you would draw for the news media for the next time that we might do that.
Well, I'm glad, John, that you said this, because you come from the news media, so you have much more credibility than I do on this. I actually agree with your assessment. I think, first of all, by way of framing, I think there's been some outstanding reporting, outstanding work. So accepting that, putting that aside. I was quite taken by an analysis that came out a few months ago showing, for example, how American news media has been much more relentlessly negative about COVID than has been other news media in other countries. I think there have been very particular biases towards negativity that have been brought to bear. There have been a reliance on social media, which I, as a non-media person, as a lay reader, it's very clear to me that the news media is far more reactive to comments on social media than it should be, to which, and from people at a variety of levels. I look at the news media to filter that, to actually not to reflect what is happening in the heat of social media, which doesn't cast light. But in fact, what often happens is the news media has been magnifying that, taking the challenge of the algorithmically driven extreme of emotion and mainstreaming. And that's not what should be happening. And I think as a result, we have collectively experienced the pandemic through a state of agitation that has not allowed us to take a step back and reason. I mean, one concrete example is the constant provision of caseness of COVID as a ticker. Now, there was reasons for that early in the pandemic, but as you know, once vaccines were introduced, cases acquire a very different meaning because now you're dealing with a very different meaning for severity and fatality. But actually, the reporting of cases did not stop. The reporting of cases continued unabated. I never saw anybody show cases of fatal drug overdose as a ticker, when in fact, we had 30% greater deaths from drug overdose in 2020 than we had in 2019, in no small part because of efforts we took to mitigate the cases that were relentlessly reported on in the news media. So I think there really needs to be a reckoning with the biases that informed media reporting, and in particular, how the instant gratification of amplifying social media has informed mainstream reporting. And you know, as a consumer, I'm not in the media, as a consumer, I think I'm sophisticated enough to be able to look at social media and say, I understand what that space is, but I'm going to look to a more mainstream media then to be my filter. But I haven't seen that happen. I've seen this amplifying this, and that for me has been a disappointment. I sort of expect more from what mainstream media does.
Do you have any other questions? I think we need to wrap it up, but I guess any parting thoughts for us at this moment?
Yeah.
What is it we need to remember and to take away from today?
Yeah, I suppose my parting thought is one of gratitude for this conversation. I feel like I have a deep confidence in our capacity as humans to get to a better place, as long as we allow ourselves the space to have the conversations and the imagination to envision a better place. And I don't know how to do that, but by having conversations like this. So I'm very grateful to everybody here in person and online for participating in this conversation and being in your own conversations. I'm very grateful to you for actually catalyzing this. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.